So I have the pleasure to get to introduce Ray again. I got to last year, and I got to tell a little story about some shade that he threw my way. This year, I sort of have to apologize to Ray for what we put him through. If you guys remember what Phil talked about with Garmin Pay and making the sausage and all that, well, so the one place that Ray could test Garmin Pay at was McDonald's. And so I sent him to McDonald's 17 nights in a row. And 16 of those nights, he got really close to a McFlurry, and he didn't get a buy one because it kept setting off this fraud alert that card must have been in Olathe because I had just used it that day. And so anyways, Ray then finally did, and I think he ended up buying multiple McFlurries that day just to get his fix in. So anyways, Rainmaker is behind DCRainmaker.com, which focuses on endurance sports technology and training, and was ranked one of the 50 most influential people in running by Runner's World magazine. The site produces the most in-depth reviews and analysis of sports technology products out on the web today, gathering more than 3 million views a month. So, please join me in giving a warm welcome all the way from his new home in Amsterdam, Rainmaker.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for having me again. I'm super excited to be here, and thank you to those that are watching online as well. Just to set a little bit of context for those that are watching online, because they can't actually see you in the audience, and obviously you can't see them. But this is the Connect IQ Symposium. It's designed or basically structured around developers, third-party developers. And so in this room here are, of course, some Garmin folks, but mostly industry folks. So they're people that are making all the gadgets and services and platforms that you love and use today. My guess is if you follow my site online or watching this online right now, you probably use half a dozen of the products that people have made in this, or the products that have been made by people in this room. So it's kind of my opportunity to talk about sports technology products and a bit of the industry side of things, and then to dive into sort of things I think are going right and some things that may not be going so right. And while I am here in Olathe and at Garmin, as most of you know, I just kind of say what I think. And so that's, regardless of where I'm sitting. And if you don't believe me, just read some of my reviews from this morning and you'll see that. It's all right, right? 2 out of 3. One wasn't, win some, lose some. So I've got lots of stuff to talk about. It's going to get pretty tech geeky at times, but that's sort of the way I am. But first, a bit about the site, a bit about kind of what it's all about in case you're not familiar with it. So it started over a decade ago now, which is crazy to think. This is like year number 11. But when I started, it was a personal blog. It was like most blogs. I talked about what I ate and like what I ran, and there's lots of hilarious posts out there if you go digging way, way back about just random me things. And then eventually started talking about sports technology products almost by accident. I had written an email to some coworkers at the time about a Polar watch, and I kind of big long email, and then I eventually bought a Garmin watch, the old Garmin 305, the Forerunner 305. And then one day I decided simply to copy and paste that big long email to coworkers into a post, and that became my first in-depth review, the Garmin Forerunner 305 in-depth review. And that's sort of what triggered all these random purchases I would make from there on out becoming posts, is this initial email string. Reviews are sort of the primary driver of traffic, but if you know from the site, I also talk about my life, what I'm doing, where I'm at. It's sort of this kind of interesting blend of me as well as sports tech gadgets and things in the industry at large. It is between 3 and 4 million views a month of people coming by looking for these sort of gadgets, and in some of that, about 2 million or so, 2 to 3 million is unique people a month. So there's a lot of people out there looking for coverage on a lot of gadgets, and it's not just watches and cycling computers. It's now drones and action cameras and across a wide range of things that I think are interesting to me. And that's sort of been my goal in life, is just to write about things that are interesting to me, as you'll see over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. And then finally, revenue for me is based not on ads from companies like everyone in the room here. In fact, I block virtually everyone in this room from attempting to advertise with me. And if I don't block you, it's purely because I didn't know to block you yet. So once I find you, I'm going to block you. And my primary revenue is based on affiliate links. So if you go on to Amazon and buy a watch, or more importantly, toilet paper, whatever it is you buy, I make a little tiny bit of it, and you don't know any better, or you don't pay any more, and I get a little bit, and it's all great. So that's my model. There are ads on the site, but it's purely like Google AdSense. If you're looking for lingerie, you're going to get lingerie ads. If you're looking for diamond rings, you get diamond ring ads. Pretty straightforward stuff. Anyway, so moving along, if the clicker will click, there we go. So more important than the site is the readers, because there's lots of things that I talk about, but the most important things are people that are reading it. And it's not just endurance geeks. It's not just like hardcore people looking at their FTP or their normalized power or whatever it may be. It's literally everyone. Some of my most popular reviews out there are basic activity trackers, basic Fitbits, and things like that. And so it's a wide range of people from couch to 5K all the way up to Olympians that are reading it. It's also across the entire industry, people like yourselves, of course, and whether that be editors at magazines or newspapers or sites or television stations, everyone's kind of looking at the site, and not just what I'm writing, but even more importantly, what the readers are writing in comments as well. Many, many reviews out there can have 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 comments in them. And that is a gold mine of information for me to be able to kind of go back and give you guys feedback, but also for you to look at those comments both on your products as well as your competitors' products and figure out what people actually want. Because those are the people that are writing there. And usually I find that the conversation tone on the site is pretty civil for the most part. So you end up getting really good quality data back from that. So what is kind of the state of the sports tech industry right now? I'd say it's pretty darn strong. It's really, really cool. There are so many different device types and categories right now that have legit competitors in them. It used to be, I would say, 3 to 5 years ago, you had a leader, and certainly you still have leaders today in one area, but very few competitors to the different spaces. Now, every single one of these categories here I can look at and name a couple products that are legitimately very good products to go ahead and consider, which is awesome. That wasn't always the case. And we're seeing kind of new categories being developed, new categories being defined, and then those categories being matured. And so while there may be devices that you look at today and go, yeah, maybe the next time around, you'll see that those quickly are iterating into kind of legitimate mainstays. And I think I'll talk about some of those categories, especially in the cycling realm where we're seeing so much new technology innovation there. Convergence is, though, king, and consumers are expecting companies to be kind of at all those doorsteps for them, and they're expecting them to go ahead and make sure the devices work across not only their own devices, but also their competitors' devices in some cases, right? People want to be able to interact, whether it be platforms to devices or devices to other devices, and certainly standards play a large part of that, but people are definitely expecting that. Now, I showed this slide back, I guess, last fall, but I think it's super important to set the stage for the rest of my presentation about wearables and sort of the baseline of things. And if we look here in 2018, even go back into late 2017, all of these things here are now considered dial tone. They are considered, you must have these in your device for a wearable device in this day and age above roughly $100. These are activity tracking. Remember back years ago where you had a $69 Fitbit, but you couldn't find that same thing in a $500 Garmin watch, right? That wasn't that long ago. But nowadays, of course, it's on everything. That's the expectation. The same with sleep tracking. Remember back when you actually had an input when you went to sleep, you had to press a little button when you went to sleep, and when you woke up again? That doesn't happen anymore. This is all considered baseline. Every device must do that, no matter how cheap it is, no matter how crappy it is, it must at least do that. Optical heart rate, again, now it's across the board. Even if some of them really suck, it's at least there technically. So it's a starting point. I think we're getting better on that. I think optical heart rate is improving. We're seeing improvements. And I think we're also seeing, more important than that, the mainstream media looking at that and saying that not all optical heart rate sensors are considered equal. And so seeing kind of that movement in that area and making them a little more accurate. Smartphone notifications, the fact that I can see Twitter on every device. Okay, maybe not the Fitbit, but every other device in the industry, I can see it on there except Fitbit. Come on, Fitbit. smartphone notifications are there for at least text and call notifications for everything, but generally speaking to see, and people do want that, by the way, so I'm making fun of Fitbit. I'm going to continue to make fun of Fitbit until they allow me to see Twitter notifications on there. And for good reason, because not everyone uses straight up, your standard iOS or Android-based text message. They use WhatsApp. They use other apps out there for different things. They use Twitter for different communication. I use Twitter to do direct messages, and I want those notifications in the same way that I want a text message. They're equally as important to me. So I think that is important. And of course, smartphone apps are now connected to platforms across the board. If you don't have a smartphone app with your device is dead in the water. And I think that's super clear now in the cycling segment as well, where it used to be cycling units would have something that connected to a PC maybe or not at all. These days, you have to have a smartphone app that connects to it in order to make progress. And last but not least, exporting of data. That is now considered dial tone, and that'll be like really dial tone by the end of next month with GDPR and some of the regulations there. But people are expecting that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a little later on. Still, there are challenges, one of those being GDPR, one of those being how companies tackle that and the regulation around that. Also, the failure of some fitness platforms to protect their data, either knowingly or unknowingly, and it's something we'll kind of dive into a bit more. The same goes with users misunderstanding how their data is visible. And of course, we're seeing that playing out in Facebook in the last few little whiles here. And we're going to see it in other areas, especially in the fitness industry, I think over the next couple of years. And again, I'll kind of dive into some of these in more detail here. One of the bigger challenges, I think, is actually kind of different and interesting, which is that the biggest players in the industry are having problems with all the baggage they have from the past. And not bad baggage, by the way. Sometimes just the enormity of their products make it so that users expect that when a company like Garmin introduces a lower cost product or a new product that has the 18,000 little features behind it that you forgot you even knew existed there. And that's hurting innovation. And I've kind of commented in the past that there is a reality that, if Garmin is missing a small feature somewhere, they'll get crucified for it, but a startup can come along and miss that same feature and no one says anything. It is a double standard, but of course it works both ways too, right? And some of that is also well earned. If you look at software stability and things like that, some of the reputation there by certain companies in the industry does have a lot of history behind it and does have a lot of reality behind it, and consumers don't forget that. So it is kind of a bit of a two-way street for some of those things, and so you gotta kind of earn your trust there. I do think one interesting bit here is that we'll see action cameras in general sort of take a back seat in 2018. We've seen so much innovation around 360 cameras and all that kind of stuff in the last couple of years, but I think people are trying to figure out their way, and obviously we see with GoPro's imminent, or whatever you want to call it, sale there as well, that kind of people are slowing down and saying maybe the phone is good enough for a lot of things, and maybe we don't necessarily need a $500 action camera for everything. So what are the trends for this year thus far? What are the things that we're looking at, I'm looking at, and kind of saying this is interesting to consider? First off is that music is considered almost a must now for any wearable above that $200, $250 price point. I think as of right now today, you could say like $300, but even then there's plenty of devices now that are sitting at $200 or $250 that have music on them, and that's going to very quickly, that price is going to drop by the end of the year to be that $200 price point that will almost be considered dial tone. Now that does not necessarily mean like subscription-based services are on all those devices at $200, but certainly the ability to load basic MP3 files and whatnot, I think will quickly drop down to that price point. Same thing for contactless payments. That's a whole different ballgame of stuff that we can dive into, but people are starting to expect that in watches, and when people compare, both myself as well as mainstream media sites, they're going to talk about that. And depending on what country you're in, that could be a more important thing than others. Here in the US, contactless payment support is a bit iffy at best when it comes to retailers and whatnot, but in places like Australia, where I was recently, it's fantastic. And so those things are going to drive the conversations differently depending on the country that you're trying to sell a device to. What's interesting here, though, is that GPS is no longer given at $200. It used to be that GPS was a given at $200, but there are devices now, like both the devices I'm wearing right now, that cost $200 or more and don't have GPS. They have connected GPS, which of course is when you go ahead and connect your phone and your phone provides GPS back. And the Apple Watch Series 1 is in that same camp as well, floating between $200 and $250 depending on sales and whatnot. And they're selling a lot of devices, and a lot of companies are selling a lot of devices in that realm, Fitbit being one of them. And it'll be interesting to see. I don't think this will last forever. I think people eventually look at that and go, that was a nice fad. But for now, it's selling devices. And then we're seeing a lot more leveraging of heart rate for better data analytics, an area that I'll dive into more. Last year I talked about this a little bit, where we're seeing companies starting to pull more heart rate data in, but not yet doing anything with it. Now I think we're starting to see companies actually present that data in some sort of useful fashion. And then as a result of that, we're starting to see companies edge towards that medical device status. If we look at the cycling side, this slide is mostly cycling focused. Aero companies, there's just lots of stuff coming, some stuff coming in 5 hours, if my time zone's right. So, there's lots of things on the way here. And a lot of that is also being driven by just other platforms like Zwift and interest in indoor cycling and making that experience more real. So making, trainers that actually shake and other trainer components that go up and down. And I mean, all these sort of crazy things. People are building these platforms with air cushions under it that shake left and right. Like the stuff that people are coming up with is nuts. It's crazy. And a lot of it's DIY, like, back to the garage, and then you put up a YouTube video that looks kind of a little shaky, but that's becoming the future, and that's going to become standard and mainstream very, very quickly, like on the order of months, not years, where you're going to find products out there doing that kind of stuff. At the same time, you're also seeing a flood of new Android-based cycling units. That's something you're going to really see over the next, I would say, 3 to 5 months or so, where companies are looking at Android and how they can quickly iterate on that. But one of the challenges they're going to have there, and I think we're already seeing that, is that just because you have Android doesn't mean you have a good cycling device. That's a very different thing, because Android is merely a platform. You still have to have a really good cycling app atop Android and atop that platform in order to be engaging. And it can't just be a collection of apps. It has to be something that is a whole cohesive app that takes care of everything from routing to STRAVA segments to workouts. All that has to be in there. Otherwise, consumers won't buy it. They do not want a blended experience. If they did want that, they would have simply bought an Android phone or a Windows or a iPhone years ago and done the same thing with different apps. But that hasn't happened, despite all the predictions to the contrary. People simply aren't using phones on their handlebars all that much. We're also seeing a pretty interesting wearables player expansion. By that I mean, yes, we all in this room know the big names of the wearables players, Suunto, Polar, Garmin, Fitbit, Apple, Samsung, but we're also seeing all these unknown, essentially Asian brands come in with really fascinating offerings. Like right here, this is a Coros Pace that was announced back at CES and should be shipping, I think, in the next couple weeks or so. This does look almost exactly, entirely, precisely like a Forerunner 735 XT, including the fonts and the icons and every other element of it. But it's there, right? It's there. It's an option on the marketplace, and people are going to choose that option based on price in some cases. And so it's really fascinating to see. And there's others out there, Amazfit's making some as well. And some of these devices are legitimately quite good, actually. Like I've been running with the Coros Pace and swimming with it and cycling with it over the winter. And it's laying down some beautiful GPS tracks. I mean, really, really nice GPS tracks. So it's easy to dismiss them as just kind of essentially a Chinese knockoff, but it's not so easy when you actually look at the data. Still, these companies are having to learn some of the challenges here. And Coros learned one that I kind of told them very early on when I went to get that data out of that watch, which is that you couldn't do that. There was no way to export the data. It was stuck there. And I said, that's not even an option. Like that is such a deal killer that like my review would be 1 paragraph long. Like it would just simply say, do not buy this because of this, and I'm done. Which, to be fair, would make my life so much easier because I would get more sleep, and not like 3 reviews this morning. So I would, those sort of things you have to still get to baseline. You have to go back and realize that those are important features to be in your product, no matter who you are, whether you're Garmin or you're a startup. That is critical. Which gets to platform security a little bit, and I think this is something that we saw recently with Under Armour and their platforms having a pretty significant leak. When you're the biggest, you fall the hardest, and that's something that we definitely saw here. And there are probably lots of reasons for that. And it's funny because back before I did this and before I worked at Microsoft, I worked in banking and I worked in acquisitions and mergers on the IT side. I did that for 5 years of acquisitions and mergers. And I would work at the time for one of the biggest banks in the US, and we acquired things like nobody's business. It was like Pac-Man with M&Ms. A dozen plus banks a year are being acquired and moving so fast until eventually the government kind of stepped in and said, maybe you should slow down a little bit. Maybe there's a good reason why you should slow down because you're not adapting and pulling all those things in. And maybe that's the same case here with Under Armour, where they swallowed so many platforms in the last few years that they couldn't pay attention to all of the security implications of that. And maybe not. Maybe they just simply didn't patch something. We might never know. But still, security in platforms, especially fitness platforms, where so much acquisition has taken place over the last few years, is going to be something I think will be in the headlines over the next while because it's a big deal. And it's one thing to lose a credit card number. It's also maybe a slightly different thing to lose all your health data and have that be out in the open. And then, especially as devices are getting more and more capable with what they're tracking beyond just simply where you went for the day, but heart stats and all sorts of different medical stats, this is something that's going to, I think, come up over and over again for the rest of the year. So, there's also another story to this. And this is, by the way, like my favorite, despair.com. If you've never seen their site, it's great. You know those motivational posters that I'm sure are in this building somewhere that say like fly like an eagle and all that kind of stuff? They make ones that are the inverse of that. Like they're awesome. So I actually bought this poster. I have it hanging. Well, right now it's in a box, but it will be hanging again soon when I finish unpacking. But it's the greatest thing ever. And in this case, STRAVA was that beacon. STRAVA was the ship back a few months ago. And it wasn't necessarily entirely fair to them either. They just got the short end of the stick. And some of that is fair. And so for those that are not familiar with this, STRAVA basically had I would say a fiasco is a fair term for it, with heat maps where they were showing in that heat map data military bases. And having spent a considerable amount of time in the government, military, et cetera, realm in IT security and whatnot, I know that from STRAVA's standpoint, they were 100% correct. Right? STRAVA cannot have a database of all secret military installations for the US and the UK and France and Germany and Australia, New Zealand, and every other country on Earth, because that would make STRAVA like the most awesome target ever from a security standpoint. They just can't have that. That's not the way security works. At the same time, it's also very, very tough to educate the general public on the implications of that. And certainly, some of that fault falls on the government, not just the US government, by the way. I was able to find tracks on other platforms that were not STRAVA's platform, for example, MovesCount and Suunto, the same thing. In less than 10 minutes, I found tracks from British and Australian users and their bases in the middle of Afghanistan, in the middle of Iraq. Very, very trivial stuff. And it's not something that you can sit there and blame the platforms directly for, because it's really a training issue. It's really those training programs, and I've actually sat there and written some of those training programs, didn't think or take account for the way data is being shared today. Which gets to the part where STRAVA is to blame, right? Which is around making it more obvious that these sort of things are happening. And STRAVA has done some good work in the last, I would say, month or so in making it more obvious as to how your data is being used. But I think the lesson here, if we go back to that ship and STRAVA as a beacon, is that you have to consider that in your own platforms. You have to consider that the data isn't always what it seems. And yes, a social network is by definition social, but you need to be careful that you're considering some of those other scenarios with your data. Again, going back to what if someone actually didn't want the location broadcast out? You thought it was anonymous, you thought it was fine, but anonymous isn't always what you think it is. And that gets a little bit to wearable app security. If you went back to like 1995, 2000 or so, and you talk to developers in that time frame, they would have said, oh, the platform's taking care of my security. They would have said, Windows is taking care of my security, or Apple's taking care of my security, or whatever the case is, they depend on the platform. And the apps were by and large like very poor app security at best, if any app security. You opened up an app and it just ran. It was magical. And then we got to like 2005, 2006, and people started realizing that wasn't necessarily such an awesome model, that if the underlying platform was compromised, then that meant your app was as well. So we moved to the point where apps were more and more implementing their own security models, and not just like crappy security models that had a username and password inside a config file on the desktop, but actually like legit security models. And I think we're looking at the same sort of paradigm in wearable apps as well, in that you need to think about your app, and you need to assume that your platform will be compromised. And I'm not talking to the platform makers here, I'm talking to the app makers, and that you need to look at your app and say, what data is in there that's valuable to someone? Is it someone's personal information? Then how can I protect that such that if the platform is compromised, that my data is still safe? In the same way that app developers do that now on desktop computers and on phones and other things, you should be looking to do that in wearable apps. And yes, it's different if you're just making an app that has beer counting miles and stuff like that. But if you're making an app that has legitimate data in there, then that's something that you should be considering and you should definitely be accounting for. And given that most of the people in this room are here because they have businesses and products and devices and whatnot to integrate with their apps on wearable devices, this probably most definitely applies to you. So what have we seen in those platforms, though, in the last 12 months? So I kind of looked back at the last 12 months and said, what has been going on? And in general, it's stabilization. Like, we haven't seen any major new wearable OS platforms come out, probably because they're just at the point where all these are starting to mature. So Apple has continued to optimize and release minor little updates of watchOS. Everything's very evolutionary. It's not so much a revolutionary update. Fitbit took Pebble and erased the name and called it Fitbit OS, and that's what we see there. And the same thing, if we look at other brands, Garmin, obviously the changes that we've been talking about today and tomorrow for Connect IQ 3.0, nothing is massive. There's no major leaps on any platform. Samsung, I don't really know what Samsung's doing, but they're making devices and making a lot of them and selling them, and people are buying them, so that definitely must be working for them. Android Wear is sort of in the same boat, kind of. They just renamed themselves and called that done, so that was their accomplishment for the year. And then Suunto just decided to simply forget it all. They just said, nope, we're not doing apps, nope, no more apps, and all the new devices are appless. So whatever works, I guess. But I think we are seeing, just as I mentioned earlier, some of those off-brand or new brands coming in, Chorus and others, aren't doing any app platform, and they're just making a killer device at a price point that people want, that's single purpose almost, and they're doing well. So it didn't necessarily mean that you have to have apps if you can start to bring in some of that functionality natively. Which gets to an interesting question. What is the definition of an app, right? And I talked about this a little bit last year, but we're seeing this a lot more this year as well. It used to be something that you as third parties developed, but there are many cases now where you're not developing anymore. You're handing off specs to a first-party company, be it Garmin or Wahoo or others, and having them build that functionality directly in, right? STRAVA is a great example of that on most platforms out there, and that STRAVA isn't necessarily developing their own apps to run on Garmin devices or run on Wahoo devices or run on Lezine or run on Polar or run on Mio or run on any other platform you choose. Instead, they're simply saying, here are our specs, you go ahead and develop to that. Best Bike Split on the Wahoo Element and Bolt is another great example of that, where yeah, it's an app sort of. Like in this room, we would kind of consider an app, but not really. I mean, Wahoo did that development, and it's done natively there, and it runs natively in the unit. A user can't uninstall it or reinstall it. So their functionality is there, but it's just not, it's different. And so that's where you kind of have to think about what is an app. Is an app separate? Is an app installable? Is it just modular in nature? And sometimes as developers, we get caught up in that, right? We'll sit there and go, well, it's got to be some set of files that we can move around easily or whatever. Users don't care about that. They just want the functionality. And so that's something to keep in mind with your products as you look to develop partnerships, is that you want to focus on making sure that the consumer is first, and the consumer gets their end goal of your product or your service or your platform delivered on that wearable or on that device, regardless of how you get there. Which gets into sort of the general trends of apps, right? And that they're no longer beer counters. And that, I mean, this room is a perfect example of that. And certainly there are countless beer mile counters out there in app stores across every platform. But the people in this room and the fact that you're all here exemplify that you're going towards a business opportunity, whether you're selling a music platform or you're selling a device or a sensor or accessory or some sort of service. You're putting work into that to make that service available in other places. Which isn't to say that like watch faces and all that things don't have their importance. They certainly do. And, Garmin mentioned that 50% of apps on Connect IQ devices today are watch faces, right? So there's definitely a huge market for that. But I think we're seeing more and more that like all the stuff that comes through me for review now, most of it, the baseline is an app on some sort of device that corresponds with it. I see that tonight on a review release. I see that tomorrow morning on a review release for new devices and sensors that tie into watches and platforms, and that's the expectation, and that it works really, really well. One click. There we go. So as we go into music surfaces, there are a lot of ways the new API, right? You look at a music service, and it's becoming something that you expect in the same way that you expect your app to be available on different platforms. You expect your app to be available on Android and iOS, and maybe if you're really super optimistic, Windows Phone. But by and large, you expect to be on platforms, and it's the same thing like you expect your site to run on Safari and Chrome, Internet Explorer, and so on. Music services have got to shift to that same mentality because I'm going to be where I am. I'm going to be on whatever device I'm using, and if your music isn't there, then I'm probably not going to use that. Just like social networks. If your social network doesn't have an app for my devices, I'm probably not going to use that. Like in my case, I use Spotify primarily. It's just what I use. I'm overseas. It works best for me. But it doesn't work on any of my wearables today. It doesn't work on this. It doesn't work on my Garmin. It doesn't work on all that stuff. And at some point, I'll decide that maybe Spotify is not for me because it's not in the place I want to be, which is a shame because I love Spotify. I listen to it like literally every waking hour of the day, except when I'm running. And then I can't. And then I'm sitting there going, which platform do I use? And I'm not going to pay for two platforms, and most consumers aren't either. And so the good news is I think we're seeing companies, both Garmin and Fitbit, and to some extent Apple, becoming the platform where different music providers can plug in and do that relatively easily and be where the users are. If they aren't where they are, then you're going to see what happens to any other platform out there, and they'll simply go away. So let's talk a little about wearables. And I mentioned earlier the contactless payments, and it's really interesting to see where this is going. And you know, I travel a lot, and so I get to have fun, like as Joe mentioned earlier, trying to buy McFlurries around the world to test contactless payment systems, because McDonald's is the most dependable place to test contactless payment systems anywhere you go in the world. And like in the case of France, when I was living there, that was really the only place it worked at, for the most part in my neighborhood consistently. Whereas Australia, where I've been for the last 3 months, it works everywhere. I went 3 months in Australia without carrying any Australian cash. In fact, I even went the last month and a half or so without even bothering to carry around a wallet. I just used it every single time, and that worked fantastic until the last week when I got stuck in a parking garage and couldn't pay for the parking anymore. But the final, last 3 days I'm there, and the parking garage will not take contactless payments. But that's definitely, it depends on the country. Australia is so far and away on contactless payments than anywhere else I've been in the world. And certainly there are other countries that are doing it really well. And then you've got the US, which is kind of just in the middle. Like Subway worked last night for me, but that's really all I've had success with so far on my trip. And obviously there are other examples of places that work, but not consistently. I can't depend on in the US to be able to walk into any store like I could in Australia. Australia, I can walk into any store anywhere, minus the parking garage, and be good to go. We're also seeing that, if you look at different platforms, Wear OS is continuing to struggle a bit. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier. And I think part of the challenge is having a single device that you can look at that and say, that is the best Wear OS device out there. And it's going to be tough until Google comes along and says, boom, here's our watch. Here's our Google Watch. I think it's going to be really, really challenging for this platform to move forward because there's no rising star they can point to. You can sit there and look at Fitbit or Apple or even Garmin or other platforms and look at them and say, that's the watch that owns that platform, that's so good on that platform. And it's really, really tough to do that on Wear OS. You're also starting to see these watches develop or starting to be in partnerships with companies to get better heart rate metrics. So lots of partnerships from many, many different companies now with FirstBeat around heart rate metrics and making sense of that data. And not just from Garmin, but from some of the smaller ones as well. Huawei is doing it, and a couple of the other kind of phone-based manufacturers are leveraging those in areas that you wouldn't expect them to. You wouldn't have expected that partnership. And that's good for the consumers because I think that shows that there is value in that heart rate data. It's It's not something that's just there for a single run or for the day when your 24/7 heart rate goes away. It's there for a longer period of time, and that data is being used to calculate other metrics beyond the way or beyond that day. As I mentioned earlier, I do think, though, that connected GPS is a bit of a short-term game. I think it's something that you can look at, but I don't think it's going to be here in 2 or 3 years. I think, by and large, everything will have GPS. The cost of chipsets is just so low that it makes sense. Other areas that I think are really interesting are indoor realism. Now, a lot of people would say, oh, this is Zwift or this is Peloton, but it's more than that. There are so many different ways that this market, and those two are, of course, the biggest out there, whether it be cycling and then now Peloton with running as well. But we're seeing other companies get into this game on the hardware side to complement these platforms, and that's where I think there's just so much potential. Like you've seen, Zwift's growth is astronomical, but it's also bringing with them plenty of other apps as well, many of which are here today, that are doing cool things in that indoor training realm. As more people become aware of the fact that you can do indoor training and be exciting and have that be interesting, that's gonna lift that tide. But I would caution you, the most important thing, I think, to Zwift's success is actually not the gamification. I think it's the UI of their platform. If Zwift's UI looked like crap, people wouldn't be playing it, right? Because there's certainly examples of Zwift that have been around in that indoor cycling realm for the better part of, 3 to 5 years that don't enjoy that same level of success as Zwift. And yes, Zwift has plenty of money behind it, all these sort of things, but more than anything else, it has a fantastic user interface. It looks beautiful, it looks pretty. You look at it and you go, that looks nice. Same is true of TrainerRoad, who is also doing incredibly well in this space. I can't say that's the same is true of every other app out there in the indoor training space, and I think by and large, you see those apps that are on an upward trajectory are the ones that have spent time on the user interface making it look pretty. Sufferfest is a great example of that, where Sufferfest UI for a number of years was lacking at best, and then they hired the developer from TrainerRoad over, and now the UI looks beautiful, and we're seeing a ton of attention and focus on Sufferfest, and users are flocking to it because it looks pretty, and they know that it's a good experience when they go to open up that application. We're also seeing companies talk about labs. Like every company here wants to have a labs site. And labs can mean different things to different people, but essentially it's like the new beta, right? When people decided that you can't have Google beta for like a decade, now we're calling it labs instead, and it works out. But what's interesting coming out of this, though, is ways people are taking the different puzzle pieces of data and making use of it. And so like Fitbit Labs here, this is an example. What you see is essentially them looking at response time for a little app that allows you to kind of quickly validate how, like a test almost, against sleep. And you can see this correlation between the slower that you are to respond on this little app test thing, the less sleep that you had, and vice versa, right? And this is a very, very basic sort of test of things. But you look today at all these silos of information we have. We've got a heart rate silo. We have a stressed silo in the case of some devices. We have a sleep silo. We have a workout silo. All these silos of data, but nothing is actually cohesively pulling it together. FirstBeat is starting to get into that area, but like, why wouldn't my watch look at me and say, you had 3.5 hours of sleep last night. You may have been a wee bit stressed this morning from 4:30 onwards trying to get some work done. We know that data. We know your stress level. We know your heart rate level. We know how much sleep you got. Why doesn't it then offer me to do something about it? Like, no device on market today, whether that's just playing piano music from the music provider that's on my watch, or it's telling me to take a breath. No device is actually proactively going out and doing that. There are things that it's got to merge together, and that's where you start getting some use out of that data as opposed to being all these silos of information. We're also seeing a lot of interest, and this kind of gets into what I just mentioned, around medical devices. And where do companies kind of go like really close to the edge and then go, maybe not, maybe get in there close. Obviously we've been seeing Fitbit talking about it since last summer, and some of the different devices, primarily with the Ionic and the Versa, and making quite a bit of a PR media sort of scene around what they're doing in the medical realm. Apple's been doing a lot of it, though most of their stuff has been kind of pushed off around third parties and having them make that racket instead. As you'll see tomorrow, Garmin is doing more in Connect IQ 3.0 around expanded heart rate level access or heart rate data access to developers. And so I think you're seeing more and more companies are getting close to being medical and trying to figure out how they can become something that's not as highly regulated of a medical device as some of their competitors in elsewhere. So I think that's something it's really fascinating to watch as companies sort of find this really fine line between things. I don't think we're going to see a lot of like short-term stuff, but I think longer term, as different regulatory bodies figure things out, that'll make this a little bit more interesting. But this is definitely the direction of where devices are going, and I think this is where you'll see a bit of the leaders separate themselves from everyone else, right? You'll see kind of the separation of the companies that are working in these fields start to have a more of an established presence that sort of validates them and says, hey, our devices are better because they can work in this medical realm, or they can at least work around this medical realm, versus other devices will kind of fall back into the background a little bit more because they don't necessarily have the credentials, if you will, of a medical type device. So I think one of the big things that is going to be really important as well when you look at acceptance of data and acceptance of application data is the standardization. I talk about this in every single presentation, standardization of data. It's like my thing in life that I'm going to keep on beating that drum. And by and large, standardization data is things are doing a great job. There's lots of progress there. I think though, if I look at the two big ticket items for 2018 that need to be kind of sorted out, aerodynamic data and running efficiency power metric data, running power data. Those are like the two big ones that I look at and go, neither of those sensor technologies will take off unless there's standardization there. So like you see right here, this is a Connect IQ data field connected to a unnamed sensor that will be announced tonight showing this aerodynamic data. Now, it captures this data, but then what happens to it? Where does it go? Well, in theory, it goes along with a fit file off to Garmin Connect, and then from there, it probably goes off to Training Peaks or STRAVA or wherever it may be, likely some sort of advanced training analytic platform. But how does that platform handle that? How does Training Peaks know that that CDA value is legitimately CDA? And how does it know that win value is the same as another device from Swiss side or from Notio or one of the other companies out there? And that's something that has to be sorted out, because all those companies have to be operating from the same sheet of music. If they're not, then companies like Training Peaks can't work with that data consistently. And if they can't work with that data, that means coaches can't work with that data. And if coaches can't work with that data, that means the riders aren't going to work with that data, and that means no one's going to buy those devices. It's got to be easy from end to end. It's got to be clean. It's got to be consistent. In the same way that having power meter standards is just so normal to us and so baseline to us. But that's how all these companies that deal with power metrics can operate. It's because those standards exist. Without those standards, then we would still be in these tiny little silos of information, and coaches wouldn't be using power across all their athletes. And so it's super, super important. I would encourage those companies that are focused on the aero side to really try to make sure that's out in the open as fast as possible and across all those companies that are in that space. I mean, there's a half a dozen aero companies today. There's a half a dozen running efficiency, power-ish type companies today. The faster you get to a standard is the point where consumers will understand your products better and coaches can go ahead and start driving them. Platforms. So on platform consolidation, I think in part because Under Armour bought everyone, it's mostly stopped, and I think it's probably a good thing. I think at this point, it's good to have more competition, and if you reduce all these platforms, you kind of lose some of that competition. We're seeing a ton of focus on coaching. Everyone wants to have a coach in their platform in some way, shape, or form. In theory, it's going to be adaptive and responding to you. Fitbit's doing a ton of work in this area. Exert's doing a ton of work at the other end, the performance side of things, and that's where I think there's a lot of potential there, but it's got to be useful. It can't be like just the old school, ad lib style, if this then that sort of thing. It's got to be something that there's actually some sort of analysis behind it that drives what's happening day to day, and taking into account all those silos of information, taking into account sleep and heart rate and stress levels, and to the point where it's actually predictive and actually useful and not as easily tricked. If it's something that you or I can trick in a day or two, then it's probably not real. It's probably just a made-up algorithm that you think kind of gets it done. It needs to be something that's hard for a human to trick because you're looking at the underlying data from sensors that support it. Next, kind of turning the page a little bit here towards getting the shot. Now, this may sound strange, and it's something that ties in a little bit earlier to the comment I made around user interfaces. And photography is so important to why people like social platforms and why people get engaged in social platforms, whether it be STRAVA or Garmin Connect or Fitbit's platforms. That's like, for me, I upload a photo with every single STRAVA activity I have, every single one. I won't even set the activity public unless it has a photo attached to it in some way, shape, or form. And Strava themselves seems to understand this. Just in the last like 24 hours or so, this little doohickey showed up in my app, which now allows me to put in place a fancy looking chart if I don't have a photo. And it's for premium members, which means that they're getting paid for this functionality in effect. And so they recognize too that there is value in that. That's why you see partnerships with Zwift and TrainerRoad and other companies to make sure that when you upload an activity from one of those, it includes a pretty picture or some portion of a picture related to your workout. And yes, that may not apply to every one of your devices and platforms out there, especially those in this room, but I think it applies to a lot of them, that people want something that's visually engaging. They want something that's visually interesting. And if they do that, or if you do that, then it draws them in and goes, oh, I should go back to that. And the same reason that I open up Instagram every night is to look at what's going on. The pictures are interesting to me. And I open up Strava and I look, and the people's activities I click on are the one that have pictures versus just data. Which gets me kind of the next point here, and one of my last points before we'll take a couple questions. A bit of a video I want to share, and I'll explain. It's going to come kind of totally out of left field, but it'll make sense when I get to the end of it, I promise. And if nothing else, I can guarantee you it will be cool. So for those of you that have followed along on Twitter, you may have seen this video. I published it. It's got a gazillion likes and retweets from a whole bunch of people. But this
Here we are, completely autonomous with the patio R1 following behind me. Right now it's somewhat open. I mean, there's tons of shrubs and bushes around me though. But around the corner here, we've got a tree tunnel. I'm really interested to see what happens with that thing once we hit that up. No idea, I haven't tried it yet. Here's the real test. Can it dip below this tunnel here?
So this thing I'm not controlling at all. It's completely 100% autonomous, following me as a human object.
It's actually following me. A bit behind, but it's following me.
And this was actually my first run. I did this like, I was so excited. I got all these cameras set up. I had cameras all
Definitely
on the trail.
cautious in here.
Completely nuts.
Really the only way to describe it. Very cautious. Still going though.
As I mentioned, this thing has
Now it's
13
catching up.
cameras on it. 13
Now it
cameras
seems to sense I'm a little closer.
me, and in theory, never lose me.
And it made it through. Damn, that is impressive.
I was like legitimately excited about this. I had no expectation this would work whatsoever. I ran this entire beast as far as you can see here, all the way up to the very, very end. And then this is like the first one I did. I did this a whole bunch of times actually, and it actually worked the very first time. But every single time I did it for up to the battery length, 15 plus minutes, it tracked me no matter where I went. I could not lose it while running. Cycling was a little bit easier to lose, but not super easy. And you can see here, like no matter where I ran, it found me. So, the reason why I mention this is kind of simple. How do I go back? No. So I mention this for one reason, because I can guarantee you almost everyone in this room, if you hadn't seen that video before, probably went, holy crap, that's crazy, right? The fact that this drone could follow this person just autonomously and see where I am, and this is what the drone sees, by the way. This is actually the view. I'm right there, riding in this case, and that's what it sees, all the objects around me it's trying to avoid, and it's doing this at a crazy number of calculations a second to do that. But you sat there, and all the people on Twitter that retweeted that and read or faded that tweet said, holy crap, that's incredible. And that is actually what you should be aiming for with your products, is holy crap. If someone looks at your products and says, holy crap, that's cool. If I look at your products and go, holy crap, that's cool, you've won. Which doesn't mean that you have to have like the most exciting product out there, because you can still get that holy crap moment even from the most mundane thing, like race pace app on Connect IQ that I've written about in the past. Like that's an app that just automatically lets you take splits as you go by different mile markers, and it's like this game-changing, mind-blowing moment if you're trying to run a marathon to realign your pace on your watch to the mile markers on the race. That's a holy crap moment. Is it like exciting as this visually? No, not exactly. It's just data and it beeps at you and they're like, oh, that's cool. But it's a holy crap moment if you've done there and played with it. In the same way that even like the most boring of services out there can have their holy crap moments, like Fitness Syncer is one out there that I've been using lately, trying to synchronize stuff across all these random ass platforms I have to get them to one place. And that your goal at the end of the day should be to have someone go, holy crap, that's awesome, because that filled the gap I needed. And for me, that was a way to get stuff off of Samsung's GPS watches, was to use that platform to sync it somewhere else. So no matter what you're doing, your goal should be, holy crap. And as I always say, the easiest way to do that is to simply just make cool shit. So thank you very much. I appreciate the time. I know we've got, I think, some time for questions, about 8 minutes worth, I believe. And I think we'll also take questions from online as well. So I forgot to mention at the very beginning, but if you are online, you can put them in the box thingy down below, and they'll ask the questions from the magic booth to here, and then we can go from there. Good for now, thanks.
So yeah, I think we have 7 or 8 minutes for Q&A, so it's absolutely open up to the audience. Does anyone have a question for Ray? I have one. I'll just start it off, because I always have a stupid one. When that drone was following you, how come you didn't just scream for help to scare people around you?
I think they were already pretty scared. That's really funny. Like, I am the most self-conscious person on earth when it comes to flying drones. The number of times I stood by that road for a long, long time waiting for no one to come by. Like I waited so there's no one around me, so no one would sit there and like criticize me later on for having someone else nearby. Like, I am super self-conscious. So there was almost no one there except some at the very, very end off in the distance on the beach walking down. But otherwise it was, I lucked out and I shot it like mid-afternoon on a weekday. And so, but yeah, it's super, super cool stuff.
Okay. I'll come back with the microphone, so that way people on Facebook can hear your question.
Hi. Do you have insights into how GDPR is impacting how these products are now being conceptualized, or the features are being, like, is that a showstopper, or how are other companies or wearables market addressing that?
Yep. I haven't seen so much showstoppers as I have delays. So I think what I'm hearing from a lot of companies is that things that they had on the docket for this year have by and large been tabled to sort out all the back-end stuff and to make sure they were good there. So that's kind of the general gist of things. I think you're also going to hear of smaller companies that will simply just kind of shrug at it, to be honest, and they're going to probably say, well, we'll figure this out down the road when someone screams about it. But as far as like conceptualizing new products, most of what I've seen, I think you even see this if you look at the marketplace at large. Most of the major software companies out there have not released anything substantial in the last 6 months when it comes to fitness features and whatnot. We're seeing just companies kind of do what they have to do to get their oncoming hardware devices out the door, but I think a lot of them are focused on GDPR behind the scenes. So I think it's definitely impacting things. Just I think once we get to beyond May, then we'll probably see more innovation going forward.
Looking for hands.
I'm not going to bite, generally. Well, again, thank you very much for the time. Oh.
You didn't touch on it, but where do you see cellular functionality with, as far as leaving a phone at home? Obviously, emergency situations still require you to carry your phone.
Definitely. I think it's, right now, to me, its most logical place is devices that are more endurance focused. To be able to put it into a watch or some sort of a tracker device that, people are going places they don't necessarily want to carry their phone with them. Like, I've always thought cycling is an interesting realm for that, but I think cycling might be better off for other avenues beyond cellular, satellite, things like that, like spot trackers and stuff along those lines. But like, because otherwise most people tend to have their phones in their back pocket. But like for me running, if I can avoid it, I don't want to take a phone with me running. I'd like to just have my watch, and I'd like to be able to get, ideally in my perfect little world, music streamed to it and not have to pre-cache music and just have it all be there. And I think that's definitely the future. I just don't know how long it'll take to get there. I suspect, though, as most people in this room probably know, that regulatory type stuff and entry to market and dealing with carriers is probably the biggest limiter right now into getting that out the door.
I have a question.
Yep.
Do you see any patterns with the new adopters of the technology? Is that coming on as a segment within the larger set of sports wearables?
New adopters, like new companies, like the core space and whatnot, or?
People who buy their first sport watch.
Oh, okay, cool, got it. Yeah, I think it's interesting because it used to be that people would get into like the lower end stuff, right? They would say, I'm going to buy a inexpensive running watch or an inexpensive cycling unit. But I think now we're seeing people just kind of go for gusto, and they're almost valuing like the smartwatch features and the smartwatch, the looks of the device, over necessarily the running functionality or the actual underlying stuff. And like I've got lots of friends that aren't really runners, but go and buy a high-end Phoenix device because they like the look of that device, they like the style of that device, and then the actual like fitness functions are almost secondary. And I think that's probably also a lot if you look at certainly the Apple Watch, right? The number of people that buy an Apple Watch for its style and design, I would guess far outweighs the number of people that actually go and run with it day to day.
Ray, I have a question. So do you ever do a workout without tracking data?
It's been a long, long time. So I did do one run though in Australia with just one watch, which that was a big step for me. I had one watch. So.
And then the follow-up to that is, what's the favorite test scenario that you have?
I like doing mountain tests, to be honest. Like I like going down to the Alps and doing tests in the Alps of devices, like doing like altimeter tests and things like that. To me, that's interesting. It's so different. Like I had one last summer before that I did 14 cycling computers on my bike. And while it's a nightmare to set up those sort of tests, because like you press the button the wrong way, it's a nightmare. To me, that's like so much more fun than just a typical run around something with 3 watches and trying to get all right. I go somewhere new, somewhere different. It's totally fun to me.
Hey Ray, a question about the use of telemetry. Is that something that you see as a growing, sending data from the watch or from your wearable, from the bike computer back to some other service where other users can either participate or review? What's your feeling on that?
It's got a lot of potential. I think one of the biggest challenges right now is that most of the platforms, there's like this gap, right? You look at something like Garmin, for example, with live track, but I can't load the course of where I'm going. So if a spectator watching me in a race, they don't have context of where I'm going, and therefore it's not quite as interesting to them. They just see this little dot. And certainly Quark has solved that with the collector device, right? What's pulling all that data in, and they're doing that kind of at different races and whatnot. But the reality is that's a different class of device than most consumers are buying. I would love to see live track type scenarios show the course, allow me to load the course in and have that displayed as well, because I think that bridges that gap between what I'm doing and just a random data point. It allows me to kind of become more engaged with that person is doing. The bigger challenge, though, for a lot of those live track scenarios is in the race side of things, getting approval from various regulatory bodies. It's the approval to transmit data outbound or potentially even inbound from the USATs of the world and things like that are a tougher nut to crack. And I don't know to what extent people in this audience and other device manufacturers have approached those bodies. My guess is not a lot, to be honest, based on what I've kind of heard. But I think having people in this room basically make those conversations with those regulatory bodies and paving that way would go a long distance versus having an individual athlete show up at a race and having a referee sit there and go, nope, you can't take that with you today, it's not allowed. That makes a big difference. Perfect. Well, thank you very much again. I really appreciate the time and look forward to chatting